Fossil fuel companies, along with Republican lawmakers, are planning on further co-opting anti-woke rhetoric in an effort to protect the lucrative business model for fossil fuel companies. This story is absolutely insane, and it revolves around an email that was obtained by Alex Koch, a former colleague of ours, does great investigative reporting. And the email was written by the director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. This is a right-wing group, and they're very much in favor of protecting fossil fuel profits. What it says is this: this morning at the ALEC committee meetings, you'll have the opportunity to push back against the woke financial institutions that are colluding against American energy producers. Now let's stop for a second and just discuss what he's referring to there. There's been one avenue in which activists have been incredibly successful in essentially persuading banks to stop investing money in fossil fuel companies, stop lending money to fossil fuel companies. We've seen some movement there, and it's been positive movement. But as always, whenever there's some positive movement for activists, lobbyists get together with these corporations and try to figure out a way to squash those efforts. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Let me give you some more details. This email, again, obtained by Alex Koch for the Center for Media and Democracy, indicates that, they're trying to make an argument that the anti-fossil fuel activism is really just discrimination. So on one hand, they're claiming, these woke activists are awful, they're so terrible, and also poor fossil fuel companies, they're being discriminated against. I'm not kidding, that's really what their argument is. And there are ramifications for this, especially when you consider the fact that our Supreme Court has deemed corporations human beings. Let me give you more. So, they've looked into how Glenn Youngkin succeeded in Virginia's gubernatorial race by manufacturing a culture war, right? By really leaning into the fear mongering on the right regarding critical race theory. And so fossil fuel companies, with the help of ALEC, a lobbying group, decided, well, why don't we just use that same strategy to protect fossil fuel companies? ALEC's Energy, Environment and Agriculture Task Force voted to back two pieces of model legislation that portray climate policy, even climate policy that doesn't even exist, as unfairly discriminating against fossil fuel companies. So what exactly is this legislation? Understand that during this meeting with ALEC, with Republican lawmakers, with fossil fuel companies, they voted on this resolution. They voted on this draft legislation, which they're now going to push Republican lawmakers to both introduce and pass through Congress. What does this entail? Well, the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act directs states to compile a list of entities that are supposedly boycotting fossil fuel companies, explicitly citing banks that are increasingly denying financing to credit-worthy fossil energy companies solely for the purpose of decarbonizing their lending portfolios and marketing their environmental credentials. So step number one, try to find the banks, the lenders, the potential investors that are taking a stand against fossil fuels in the name of doing something about climate change. And then after you list who they are, it's time to target them. But to do so through legal means based on this proposed legislation that in their minds would ideally pass. The act also cites institutional investors that are divesting from fossil energy companies and pressuring corporations to commit to the goal of the Paris Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by 2050, and large investments that are colluding to force energy companies to cannibalize their existing business or businesses. And what this legislation would do, should it pass in Congress, is it would allow for state controllers would be directed to create and maintain a list of all financial companies that boycott energy companies, further allowing them to, quote, request written verification from a financial company that it does not boycott energy companies. Any company that does not reply to said request within 61 days per the model bill would be presumed to be boycotting energy companies. All right, great. So they've got this nice little list, and let me just make sure you all know it would be a very short list of financial institutions or investors who refuse to do business with fossil fuel companies. And then what would they do with that list? What would happen to these financial institutions or to these investors who don't want to invest in fossil fuel companies? Listed companies that don't stop boycotting energy companies within 90 days would then be subject to losing state contracts or investments. State agencies would then be required to sell, redeem, divest, or withdraw all publicly traded securities in qualifying companies unless that would result in a loss in value or a benchmark deviation. In fact, attorneys general would actually be empowered to enforce rules mandating that state agencies report which companies are refusing to invest in fossil fuel companies, and essentially go after them if they are in fact boycotting fossil fuel companies. So what this proposed legislation written by ALEC would do is punish any financial institution or any investor who, based on a political point, based on wanting to do something in regard to climate change, has refused to invest in fossil fuel corporations and companies. That's what this is. Punish them for not investing their money in fossil fuels. Think about how insane that is. And this is something that is going to be championed by members of the Republican Party. And listen, we have a ton of criticism for Democrats. We do not discriminate on this show when it comes to political parties. There's corruption and bad behavior on both sides. There's no question about that. But when you consider the fact that the Republican Party consistently argues that they're the party of freedom, that they believe in free markets, that they believe that it's wrong to censor people, it's wrong to force people to do things they don't want to do. They are literally, in this case, pushing for legislation that would punish financial institutions and investors who refuse to invest in fossil fuel companies, who boycott fossil fuel companies. Both draft laws, by the way, exhibit the emerging right-wing argument that policy that reduces emissions is discriminatory. Right, so that's the argument that they're making here, and they're using the precedent set by anti-BDS legislation to make this argument. Okay, so major banks and investment firms, Isaac, the gentleman we heard from earlier, argued in his email to participants, urging them to vote for the measure, are colluding to deny lending and investment in fossil fuel companies, using their market power to force companies to make green investments. The model legislation opposes that, he adds, by setting forth a strategy in which states use their collective economic purchasing power to counter the rise of politically motivated and discriminatory investing practices. So some of you might wonder, how the hell can anyone discriminate against a corporation? Like, corporations aren't people, right? Except our Supreme Court has noted in their Citizens United ruling that corporations are in fact people. How disastrous is that? But it goes further. As I mentioned earlier, this is modeled after anti-BDS bills. What is that? Well, the legislation is modeled explicitly on anti-BDS bills written to counter the boycott, divest, sanctions call from Palestinian civil society groups for economic sanctions against firms complicit in the Israeli occupation there. So corporations are like, ooh, that is delicious. Look at what they're doing in regard to political activism for human rights for Palestinians. Maybe we can expand upon that and use it to our advantage and pretend that that woke activists are attacking us unfairly and we're being discriminated against. And so those who are discriminating against us by boycotting us need to be dealt with appropriately. That's what this story is about. And it's terrifying. Again, because of two different reasons. Because of the Supreme Court deeming corporations human beings, which is insane. And because this is modeled after anti-BDS bills, which haven't completely been struck down by our Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court is an issue as well because, as we've learned, the conservative members who were confirmed as Supreme Court justices are very much pro-business, pro-corporate. I would be a little concerned about them voting in favor of protecting the corporate interests in this case, as opposed to the freedoms of financial institutions or investors. It's pretty incredible. And by the way, if you're wondering whether this has been tested at all, it actually has in the state of Texas. Texas already has a similar law on the books. Arguing in favor of the bill, Texas State Representative Dennis Paul said there was a need to, quote, stand up to this wokeness. It's incredible. This country is governed by corporate greed and corporate interests. And while we do have a problem with discrimination in this country, in regard to actual human beings, in regard to actual disenfranchised groups of people, that just gets pushed aside. In fact, not just pushed aside, the messaging and activism surrounding that gets co-opted in order to protect corporate interests. In this case, fossil fuel companies. It's absolutely sick. And by the way, a lot of great independent outlets like the New Republic wrote about this, but not much coverage elsewhere. So thank you for supporting TYT and giving us a platform to be able to share these stories as much as we can.